For nearly 2 years, Marcus Reeves had loved a woman he believed he understood completely. He knew she drank her tea with too much honey and always let it go cold before finishing it. He knew she cried during nature documentaries and claimed it was allergies every single time. He knew the thin scar along her collarbone and the story she told about a childhood bicycle accident. And he knew the way she hummed church hymns under her breath when she thought the room was empty. He knew she loved his daughter fiercely, as though the girl had been born to her instead of merely arriving in her life. He believed he knew everything that mattered about Grace Whitfield. He did not know her name was on the side of a 50-story tower downtown. He found that out on a Tuesday morning, standing in a suit that had been pressed the night before by his own unsteady hands, holding a folder full of signatures gathered from mechanics and school teachers and a 15-year-old boy who had nowhere else to turn. He had walked into the headquarters of Whitfield Sterling Holdings to beg a room full of strangers to spare the only garage his neighborhood had left. The car that had broken down in front of him on that first rainy night, the one he had fixed for free on the shoulder of a dark road, had been part of a story built to keep him from ever asking the right questions. He had not known that either, not until the conference room doors opened, and there she was, Grace Whitfield, the woman who had sat up with his sick daughter until dawn, the woman who had told him she was nobody important, seated at the head of a long table while a dozen executives addressed her as the sole heir to one of the largest companies on the eastern seaboard. If you have ever loved someone and later wondered whether you truly knew them at all, stay with this one, because it goes somewhere worth following. And if this is your first time here, consider staying a while longer, because there is always another story waiting. Marcus Reeves had built his entire life around two things that never changed: his daughter and his word. He was 36 years old, raised in the Fulton Heights section of Baltimore, in a row house 2 blocks from the garage his own father used to run before arthritis took his hands. Marcus had never once pretended to be anything other than what he was. 6 days a week, he worked at Reeves Auto and Diesel, a shop on the corner of Payson and Lombard that had outlasted 3 recessions and 2 attempts by the city to rezone the block. The place was not glamorous. The concrete floor had been stained permanently by decades of oil. The radio only reliably picked up a gospel station and an oldie station, and the waiting room chairs had been reupholstered so many times that nobody remembered their original color. But the garage was more than a business. 4 afternoons a week, Marcus ran a free vocational program for teenagers from the neighborhood, kids who had nowhere to be after the final bell rang, and options that seemed to narrow a little more with every passing year. He taught them how a transmission worked, how to read a torque wrench, how to show up on time even when nobody was checking, and how to take pride in something they had built with their own hands. His daughter, Zoe, was 9 years old and sharper than most adults gave her credit for. She had her father's steady eyes and a running list of very strong opinions about books, breakfast, and the correct way to organize a toolbox. She also lived with a mild but closely monitored heart condition, the kind that required quarterly visits to a cardiologist and an insurance plan that never quite covered what it should. Marcus did not complain about any of it. It was simply the architecture of his life. One more thing he managed with the same quiet discipline he brought to everything else. His daughter's mother had left when Zoe was 5, and he rarely spoke of that either. To anyone who did not know him, Marcus looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a black man in work clothes who smelled faintly of engine grease and chose his words slowly, as though every one of them had to earn its place in a sentence. Some people mistook that deliberateness for simplicity. Those people were wrong every time. Marcus lived by a code, and he never apologized for it. You do not lie to the people who trust you. You do not walk away from someone who needs you. And you never let the size of your bank account decide the size of your character. He had tried to teach Zoe the same thing in every way he knew how. Being poor is nothing to be ashamed of, he told her once, tucking her into bed. Losing your dignity is the only thing that should ever scare you. Grace Whitfield walked into his life on a Wednesday night in late October, during the kind of rain that turns a city into a smear of headlights and reflection. Her car had stalled 2 blocks from the garage, an older sedan she had deliberately chosen because it drew no attention from anyone who might be looking for her. She was standing beside it in the downpour, a canvas bag pressed to her chest like it held something irreplaceable. When Marcus drove past on his way to collect Zoe from a neighbor's apartment, he pulled over without thinking twice about it. She was drenched and clearly exhausted, and when he offered to look under the hood, she did not argue. It took him 20 minutes to coax the engine back to life. When she reached for her wallet to pay him, he waved it off without hesitation. She studied him the way someone studies a thing they were told did not exist anymore. "Why?" she asked. "Everybody has a bad night," he said, already turning back toward his truck. "No reason to let a bill make it worse." 3 days later she came by the garage just to say thank you. The following week she came again, and the week after that, until it stopped being a coincidence and started being something else entirely. She brought Zoe a book about a girl who built her own robots and sat with her at the workbench while Marcus finished a brake job on the other side of the shop. By the time he looked up, Zoe was reading aloud, and Grace was listening like there was nowhere else in the world she needed to be. That was how it began. By December, Grace had become part of the rhythm of their lives, showing up 3 or 4 afternoons a week, always unannounced, always in a rotation of the same soft, worn sweaters. She told him she worked part-time at a neighborhood library while she figured out her next step after what she called a difficult family situation. Marcus did not push. He understood the particular privacy of people rebuilding themselves, the way some people needed to live entirely in the present tense before they could talk honestly about the past. What he noticed instead was smaller and, in its own way, more convincing. She remembered exactly how Zoe liked her grilled cheese: no crusts, extra cheese, cut into triangles instead of rectangles. She never once talked down to the teenagers in his program, never flinched at the noise or the mess or the rough edges of a neighborhood some outsiders were afraid to drive through after dark. When she laughed, it was always at something true, never performed for an audience. And he noticed, though it took him longer to admit it even to himself, that he had started scanning the parking lot for her car before he had even climbed out of his own truck each morning. They became a couple the way honest things usually happen, gradually, and then all at once. A dinner that ran too long to be accidental, a hand held across a diner table and never let go. A night when Zoe fell asleep between them on the couch and neither of them moved for 2 hours, because moving felt like it would end something neither one of them was ready to lose. Grace told him once that he was the first person who had ever made her feel ordinary, and she said it like it was the greatest gift anyone had ever given her. He told her she was the least ordinary person he had ever met in his life. She called him biased. He told her she was right, and he refused to apologize for it. For a while, that was enough. For a while, it was everything he needed. Then Zoe collapsed at school on a Thursday afternoon in February. It was not catastrophic. The cardiologist would later call it an episode rather than an emergency, but it was enough to send Marcus into a kind of free fall he had not experienced since the day his ex-wife packed her bags. He reached the hospital in under 20 minutes, still in his work clothes, his hands trembling in a way he could not will still. Zoe was awake and annoyed by all the fuss, which he chose to read as a good sign. But the attending physician wanted a follow-up with a pediatric cardiac specialist. And when Marcus looked at the name on the referral slip, he felt the familiar cold weight of a number he could not cover settle into his chest like a stone. Grace was already in the waiting room when he came out. He had not called her. She had seen the school's notification light up his phone screen when he grabbed his keys, and she had followed without asking permission. 3 days later, she told him she had found a community health initiative that covered specialist consultations for families who were uninsured or underinsured, and that she had already scheduled the appointment. All he had to do was show up. The specialist, a woman named Dr. Ades Nwosu, was not the kind of physician who ordinarily accepted walk-ins from community programs. Marcus knew enough about how the world worked to understand the difference between a sliding scale clinic and a doctor with a 6-month waiting list. The office sat on the 20th floor of a glass tower downtown, and the receptionist greeted Grace by her first name before either of them had said a word. Marcus noticed the way Dr. Nwosu spoke to Grace, not warmly exactly, but with the particular care people reserve for someone whose good opinion is worth keeping. He noticed the man in a dark suit, posted near the elevator bank for the entire length of their visit, who did not appear to be waiting for anyone in particular. He noticed that when Grace's phone rang in the hallway, she stepped away quickly and returned with her face arranged into practiced neutrality. He said nothing about any of it. Zoe's results came back better than anyone had expected, and Marcus told himself that was the only thing that mattered. But a question had been planted, and in his experience, questions did not disappear simply because a man chose not to ask them out loud. Marcus was not a suspicious man by nature. He had spent enough of his own life being watched in stores, pulled over on quiet roads, and doubted in rooms where he was the only black man present, that he had made a deliberate choice early on never to become someone who carried that same narrow suspicion and aimed it at other people. It cost too much. It corroded something essential in a man. So when the small questions about Grace began piling up in the back of his mind, he did not act on them right away. He watched, and he waited, and he extended her the same good faith he would have wanted extended to himself. But the details kept arriving. 3 weeks after Zoe's appointment, Marcus pulled into the alley behind the garage and saw Grace stepping out of a black SUV he had never seen before, the kind of vehicle that did not belong on that block, not because of the make, but because of the way it idled at the curb with tinted windows and a driver who never turned around. Grace spotted him and crossed the street smiling, explaining that a friend had given her a ride because her regular car was in the shop. The explanation arrived without a single beat of hesitation. It was entirely plausible. He accepted it. 2 weeks later he found a keycard lying on the kitchen counter, fallen from the pocket of her jacket. The logo stamped across the front was small and precise. A stylized compass rose above 2 capital letters, W and S. He knew that logo. Everyone in the city knew that logo. Whitfield Sterling Holdings had its name carved into 3 buildings downtown, and it spent months in the local news over a string of development deals that were pushing longtime residents out of their own neighborhoods. When Grace came back from the bathroom, he held the card up without a word. She did not flinch. She said she had done some contract consulting for them the previous year, purely administrative, nothing worth mentioning, and that she had forgotten the card was even in that pocket. She took it from him gently, slid it into her bag, and asked if he wanted more coffee. He said yes. He watched her walk to the kitchen, and said nothing else. The problem was never that her explanations sounded unconvincing. The problem was that they were too clean, each one arriving exactly the right size to cover the gap it needed to fill. Marcus had grown up around people who lied badly, and people who lied well, and he had learned that the difference between the two was never intelligence, it was practice. Grace's explanations had the polish of things that had been rehearsed. He did not confront her. He thought instead about everything he stood to lose if he was wrong, not just for himself but for Zoe, who had started inventing nicknames for Grace and saving drawings for her, and quietly, completely, reorganizing her understanding of what their family looked like. He thought about his own chest, and how strange it felt lately whenever he woke up and she was still there beside him. He chose, consciously, to believe her, and he tucked the rest of his doubt into the place where he kept the things he was not ready to examine directly. But he had crossed a line he could not walk back from. He was no longer simply in love. He was in love and watching. And living inside both of those things at once is an exhausting way to spend a season of your life. Spring arrived in Baltimore the way it always did, grudgingly, with cold mornings that lied about the afternoons that followed them. Marcus and Grace settled into the kind of relationship that never announced itself loudly, but showed up in every corner of a life instead. She learned which burner on his stove ran hot. He learned that she needed 20 quiet minutes after a difficult phone call before she could talk about whatever had been said. They learned each other the way you learn a road you drive every single day, not through memorization, but by feeling the moment something is slightly off. On Saturdays, they let Zoe lead them through Druid Hill Park. On Sunday evenings, Grace sat at the kitchen table, grading reading logs for a literacy program, while Marcus worked through invoices for the shop. It was ordinary, and it was the kind of ordinary that people who have survived real chaos learn to treat as sacred. At the garage, the vocational program was thriving. 10 teenagers were enrolled that semester, showing up 4 afternoons a week to learn diagnostics, brake work, and the mechanical logic that connects one system of a car to every other system. Marcus had recently acquired a second donated vehicle for the program, a pickup with a seized engine that the kids were slowly learning to rebuild from the block up. It was slow, deliberate work, and that was exactly the point. You learn patience by doing the kinds of things that demand it. Grace spent time at the shop whenever her schedule allowed, bringing sandwiches, helping with reading and math when the younger kids needed it, and never once positioning herself as anything other than someone glad to be there. The teenagers accepted her the way teenagers accept adults, who never try too hard, slowly, on their own terms, without any ceremony required. What Marcus did not know during any of this was how much pressure was building on the other side of Grace's life. 6 months earlier, her grandfather, Elias Whitfield, the man who had built the company from a single real estate office into a conglomerate with holdings across 3 industries, had died. His will was unambiguous. Grace was the sole heir, but the board of directors, led by a man named Richard Colton, who had spent 2 decades positioning himself as the true operational backbone of the company, had no intention of handing control to a 34-year-old woman he considered unready and inconvenient. Colton had been engineering a workaround for months. There were restructuring contracts drafted, agreements designed to strip Grace of any real authority while leaving her name on the letterhead as a decorative figurehead. He had lawyers, he had allies on the board, and he had a timeline that was closing in fast. Grace had been living quietly in Marcus's neighborhood, specifically to stay off Colton's radar, while she built her own case, gathering documents, identifying which board members could still be trusted, and working with an outside attorney to understand exactly what she was walking into. She had not planned to fall in love in the middle of it. She had not planned any of this at all. And buried inside one of Colton's pet development initiatives, a neighborhood redevelopment package he had been quietly advancing for over a year, was a land acquisition that included the very block where Reeves Auto and Diesel stood. Grace had discovered it 4 weeks earlier. She had told herself she would fix it before Marcus ever had to find out. She would stop the acquisition from inside the company, strike the garage from the list, and handle the entire mess quietly. She repeated that promise to herself every single day. She still had not figured out how to keep it. The community meeting was held on a Wednesday night in the basement of Mount Olive Baptist Church, called by a coalition of residents and small business owners who had heard rumors about the Whitfield Sterling redevelopment plan, a glossy proposal promising mixed-use housing, new retail, and what the brochure called activated community corridors, which everyone in the room understood to mean the quiet erasure of everything currently standing there. 52 people, packed into folding chairs beneath humming fluorescent lights, passing around printed copies of the proposal, talking over one another with the particular urgency of people who have learned that by the time official decisions are announced publicly, the real decisions were already made somewhere else, weeks earlier, in a room they were never invited into. Marcus sat near the front. Grace sat 3 rows behind him, having come because he asked her to, telling herself the entire drive over that her presence meant nothing, that she was simply a woman sitting in a church basement beside the man she loved. She almost believed it. The trouble started when a local developer named Trent Ashford took the floor. Ashford held a subcontracting stake in the Whitfield Sterling project that would become significantly more valuable the moment the acquisition moved forward. He was not a stupid man, but he was an impatient one. And when the discussion turned to the vocational program at Reeves Auto and Diesel, he said exactly what he thought. He called the program a nice gesture, then added that the kids it served were not the kind of kids who changed their trajectories, that some people were simply too far gone by 16 to be worth the investment, and that the neighborhood needed to start thinking about growth instead of sentiment. Then he looked toward the back of the room, directly at Jamal Carter, 16 years old, 8 months into the program, a boy who had stolen a car radio 2 years earlier and had not done anything like it since, a boy quietly becoming one of the sharpest students Marcus had ever taught. Some of these kids already decided who they are, Ashford said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. The room went silent, in the way rooms go silent when something has been said that can never be unsaid. Marcus stood up. He did not raise his voice, and people would remember that detail for years afterward, how completely calm he stayed. He turned first to look at Jamal, then faced the room. He said that in his experience, a child does not become lost because of a single bad decision. He said the kids in his program had made mistakes because they were human and young and living inside circumstances most of the people in that room would not survive for a single week. He said that writing off a 16-year-old was not realism, it was cowardice dressed up in the language of practicality. Then he put a hand on Jamal's shoulder and said, "A kid does not fail because he made one wrong turn. He fails when every adult in the room decides the road is not worth fixing." Jamal said nothing, but he stopped staring at his shoes, and his jaw stopped trembling. Ashford tried to respond. Someone else cut him off before he could finish. The meeting dissolved into overlapping arguments, and Marcus sat back down, 3 rows behind him. Grace pressed her fingers to her mouth and stared up at the ceiling, refusing to cry in a church basement over a man she had been lying to for the better part of a year. Her eyes burned anyway, and her hands would not stay still. In that exact moment she understood, with complete and unbearable clarity, that she had fallen in love with Marcus Reeves, not because he was kind to her, but because he was kind in the same direction even when he thought no one was watching, which made everything she had not told him feel less like a secret and more like a wound she had been quietly inflicting one careful day at a time. She drove home alone that night and did not sleep. The official notice arrived on a Friday morning, printed on formal municipal letterhead, its language precise in the way paperwork is precise when it has been designed to make the destruction of a community feel like a scheduling matter. Reeves Auto and Diesel had 30 days to vacate the premises. The land had been designated for redevelopment under a commercial acquisition filed by Whitfield Sterling Holdings. Appeals could be submitted in writing to an address downtown that everyone in the neighborhood already knew led nowhere. Marcus read it twice at his workbench, folded it carefully, and slid it into his shirt pocket. Then he finished the brake job he had been in the middle of, wiped the grease from his hands, and walked to the break room where two of his longtime mechanics, brothers named Andre and Curtis Dawson, were eating lunch. He told them what the notice said. He watched their faces. He told them he intended to fight it. Neither brother looked surprised. Neither looked especially hopeful either. They looked like men who had watched this exact story play out before, in other neighborhoods, to other people. Jamal was in the shop that afternoon for his regular session, halfway through a diagnostic exercise when Marcus told the group what was happening. Jamal listened without expression, the particular stillness of a teenager absorbing something he had already half expected. When the younger kid started asking questions, Jamal stayed quiet. After the session ended and everyone else had gone home, he lingered behind and helped Marcus stack equipment without being asked to. He did not say a word, he simply stayed. Marcus noticed. He said nothing either. Some things do not require language. The signs about Grace had been accumulating for weeks, each one small enough to dismiss on its own, collectively impossible to keep ignoring. He had seen the black SUV twice more, different drivers, same tinted glass, the same practiced invisibility. He had caught fragments of phone calls, numbers that sounded suspiciously like figures on a balance sheet, a reference to something called a board vote, a name that might have been Colton. Once, coming home earlier than she expected, he found her standing on the fire escape with her back to the apartment, speaking in a low, controlled voice that shifted the instant she sensed him behind her, the way a person changes gears without even thinking about it once they realize they are being watched. Every time she had an explanation, every time the explanation fit, he had begun to understand that this was precisely the problem. It was never that her explanations sounded implausible, it was that they were always ready, prepared in advance, as though some part of her had been expecting to need them. Grace was not a careless woman. If there had truly been nothing to hide, there would not have been so much consistently rehearsed to say. The night before he was scheduled to walk into Sterling Tower, Marcus sat with Zoe at the kitchen table, helping her finish a school project about community heroes. She had chosen him as her subject, which embarrassed and moved him in equal measure. She had drawn the garage with 3 small figures standing in the lot: herself, her father, and a woman with long dark hair, labeled Grace in careful block letters. Marcus studied the drawing for a long time. Later, after Zoe had gone to bed, Grace sat beside him on the couch, and he could feel her wanting to say something. The silence between them had a different texture than usual that night, heavier, with something shifting underneath it. He thought about asking her directly. He thought about laying the eviction notice on the coffee table between them and simply watching her face. He did neither. He told himself he wanted to hear what the company had to say first. He told himself he was being measured rather than avoidant. But the truth, the part he would not say out loud even to himself, was that he was not ready for the answer. He had built something real inside this life. A daughter who drew pictures of their family. A woman who made ordinary evenings feel like they mattered. A community he was willing to go to war for. He was not ready to discover how much of it had been resting on ground that could not hold his weight. He went to bed. He did not sleep. In the morning, he put on his only good suit and went to fight for his garage. The elevator opened onto the 32nd floor of Sterling Tower, and Marcus stepped into a hallway that cost more per square foot than his entire monthly rent. He had been inside offices like this before, not often, but often enough to recognize how they were built to work on a person. The art on the walls had been chosen to signal taste rather than feeling. The receptionist smiled in a way that communicated welcome and distance in the exact same breath. The carpet swallowed every sound so completely that he became aware of his own footsteps only through their sudden absence. Everything in that hallway existed to remind a visitor of the difference between the people who owned rooms like this one and the people occasionally permitted inside them, temporarily, by appointment, with an agenda that would be reviewed and, very likely, declined. Marcus checked in at the front desk, gave his name, stated his business. He was asked to wait. He sat near a window and looked out over the city. Baltimore spread beneath him in every direction, the neighborhoods he had lived in and worked in and raised his daughter in reduced from that height to a pattern of rooftops that looked, from so far up, entirely rearrangeable. He thought about Jamal staying late to stack equipment without being asked. He thought about Andre and Curtis eating lunch in silence after he read them the notice. He thought about Zoe's drawing, the small figure with long dark hair, labeled in careful block letters. A woman in a charcoal blazer appeared and told him the board was ready. The conference room sat at the end of a long corridor behind double doors that opened inward. Marcus straightened his jacket, tucked the folder under his arm, and walked through. The room was enormous, a table built to seat 16, floor-to-ceiling windows turning the entire city into a backdrop. 9 people were already seated, attorneys along one side, executive staff along the other, every one of them watching the door the moment he stepped through it. He scanned their faces the way he scanned any room where he was outnumbered. Then his eyes moved to the head of the table, and the folder nearly slipped from his grip. Grace was seated at the far end, in a winter white blazer, her hair pulled back cleanly, her hands folded in front of her, with the particular stillness of someone trained never to show what she was actually feeling. She looked exactly like herself, and nothing at all like the woman who left tea rings on his kitchen counter. A small placard in front of her read, G. Whitfield, Sole Heir, Whitfield Sterling Holdings. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that room made a sound. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway. He was aware of the attorneys watching him. He was aware of the executives watching him. He was aware, distantly, that his own face was doing something he could no longer control. He looked at Grace, and she looked back at him. And he saw in her expression exactly what she had been carrying for a very long time. Not malice, not calculation, but a slow, collapsing dread. The look of someone watching something they should have stopped a long time ago finally arrive at their door. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. Mr. Reeves, please, take a seat. Marcus did not move. He looked at the placard. He looked at the attorneys. He looked at the empty chair they were gesturing toward, positioned at the opposite end of the table from Grace, the supplicant's chair, the seat reserved for people who had come to ask something of others, who had already made up their minds. He looked at Grace one final time. She opened her mouth to speak. He shook his head, not angrily, not for effect, just one small motion that meant not here, and not like this, and not in front of every one of them. He set the folder down on the table near the door. Then he turned and walked back out exactly the way he had come in. The elevator doors closed behind him, and he rode 32 floors down in complete silence, watching his own reflection distort across the polished steel. Grace caught up with him in the parking garage on the second sublevel. She had excused herself from the conference room within 2 minutes of his departure, telling the attorneys the meeting was postponed, and taken the stairs the entire way down. She found him standing beside his truck, keys already in hand, not yet inside. She could tell from the set of his shoulders that he had heard her footsteps and chosen not to turn around. Marcus. He turned. His face had been arranged during the elevator ride into the particular composure of a man deciding how he was going to hold himself together in front of another human being. I need you to let me explain, she said. Go ahead, he answered. Those 2 words were not cold. They were something far worse than cold. They were careful. The voice of a man extending a fair hearing to something he was already grieving. Grace told him everything. She told him about her grandfather and the inheritance, and Colton's campaign to strip her of authority before she could ever take control of the company. She told him she had hidden her identity, not to deceive him, but to protect herself from a board that monitored everyone close to her and would have used any relationship as leverage. She told him the Fulton Heights acquisition had been Colton's initiative, launched before she had the legal power to override it, and that she had been working from inside the company to kill it without alerting the executive committee. She told him she had meant to tell him the truth long before it ever came to this. She told him she was sorry, and that the word felt small and useless even as she said it. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting once. When she finished, the parking garage was very quiet, only the distant hum of traffic filtering down from the street and the low buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. "I believe you," he said. Grace's breath left her in a small, hopeful rush. "I believe every word of it," he continued. "I believe Colton is exactly what you're describing. I believe you were in an impossible position. I believe the acquisition was never your idea." He paused. "None of that is what's tearing me apart right now." "Then what is?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "You watched me read that notice at my own kitchen table. You watched me tell Andre and Curtis their jobs might be gone. You watched Zoe draw a picture of our family and write your name inside it." His voice never rose, and that made it harder to hear, not easier. "You knew exactly what that garage meant to every person inside it. You knew what it meant to those kids. And you still came home every night and let me believe we were telling each other the truth." "I was trying to fix it," she said. "Without telling me," he said. "Because you decided what I could handle and what I couldn't, same as everyone else who's ever looked at a man like me and decided he wasn't owed the full picture." He stopped himself. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped even lower. "I don't care that you're rich, Grace. I care that you let my daughter fall in love with a version of you that you were never planning to show me completely." Grace had no answer for that, because there was no answer that could survive it. "I need you to give me some distance," he said. "I need you to stay away from the garage for a while. I need you to stay away from the apartment." He opened the truck door. "Whatever you do with that company is your business. What happens between us is mine, and right now I need room to figure out which one I still trust." He climbed in. He did not slam the door. He pulled out of the space with the same deliberate care he applied to everything in his life, and drove up the ramp toward the street. Grace stood alone on that empty parking level for a long time after his taillights disappeared. Then she straightened her blazer, walked back to the elevator, and pressed the button for the 32nd floor. She had a board meeting to finish. After that, she had a company to dismantle and rebuild from the inside, one dishonest piece at a time, and a man to become worthy of again, whether or not he ever let her prove it. The weeks that followed were the quietest Marcus had experienced in years, and not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the other kind, the kind that settles into a house after something important has been removed from it. When the absence takes on a shape and a weight of its own, and a man keeps reaching for something that simply is not there anymore. He went to the garage every morning. He came home every evening. He cooked dinner, checked Zoe's medication, helped with homework, read to her when she asked. He did everything he was supposed to do, and he did it well. But there was a flatness to those days he could not fully explain, and did not try to, not even to himself. Zoe did not ask about Grace directly. She was 9 and perceptive, and she understood, in the way children understand things nobody explains to them, that the subject had sharp edges. She worked around it the way you work around a bruise on someone you love, giving it room, never pressing. Until the night she stopped giving it room. It was a Thursday, 3 weeks after the parking garage. Marcus had just checked her medication, and was reaching to turn off the bedside lamp when Zoe looked up at him with the expression she wore only when she had been carrying a question longer than felt comfortable. "Dad," she said, "if I did something wrong because I was scared you'd be mad, like if I hid something because I didn't want things to change, would you stop loving me?" Marcus sat back down on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter, her careful eyes, her hands folded neatly on top of the blanket, the deliberate steadiness of a child trying very hard to ask a question without revealing exactly why she was asking it. He knew precisely what she was doing. He knew exactly whose name was hiding underneath the question. "No," he said. "Nothing you could do would ever stop that. Even if the thing you hid was really big? Even then." Zoe nodded slowly, satisfied in the particular way children are satisfied when they receive an answer they needed but were not sure they would get. She rolled onto her side and closed her eyes. Marcus sat in the dark for a long time after she fell asleep, thinking about what it truly meant to hide something out of fear rather than malice. out of the specific terror of losing the one thing that had finally started to feel like solid ground beneath your feet. He had felt that fear himself. Every single time he chose not to ask Grace a direct question, every time he folded his doubt away, because the alternative was a conversation that might end something he was not ready to lose. He was not ready to forgive her. He wanted to be honest with himself about that much. The wound was real, and it deserved time, and he was not going to rush past it just because his daughter had asked a careful question in the dark. But he was beginning to understand the difference between being deceived by someone who wanted to use him and being failed by someone who was simply terrified of losing him. Those were not the same wound. They did not carry the same weight, and they did not deserve the same response. He needed to see what Grace did when nobody was watching her, not what she promised, not what she apologized for, but what she actually chose to do in the weeks ahead, with no audience and no guarantee that forgiveness was waiting anywhere at the end of it. That was the only thing that could tell him what he actually needed to know. He turned off the lamp and went to sleep. Grace did not make it easy to keep watching her, which was the first thing Marcus noticed. There was no performance in it. No grand gestures aimed in his direction. No intermediaries showing up at the garage with carefully worded messages. No flowers appearing on his doorstep. What happened instead unfolded in public, across the pages of the Baltimore Business Journal, and inside the quiet, deliberate restructuring of a company that had spent years treating entire neighborhoods as line items on an acquisition spreadsheet. The first report broke on a Monday morning. A financial reporter had obtained internal Whitfield Sterling documents proving that Richard Colton's development division had systematically inflated land valuations across 5 different Baltimore neighborhoods, forced out small business owners through predatory lease terminations, and routed the resulting profits through a subsidiary designed specifically to obscure the paper trail. The source was never named in print, though anyone paying attention to the timeline could guess. The documents themselves were unimpeachable. By Wednesday, Colton had resigned under pressure. By Friday, 3 members of the executive committee had followed him out the door, and a 4th was under formal investigation by the state attorney general's office for his role in the falsified valuations, a development the local news covered for 3 straight nights. Marcus read every article at his workbench between jobs. He did not say a word about any of it to anyone. The second development arrived 2 weeks later, when the Fulton Heights acquisition was formally and permanently withdrawn. The notice came through the same municipal channel as the original eviction, the paperwork just as formal, just as precise, except this time it stated that the land designation had been reversed and the property returned to its original community use classification. No explanation was given. No name was attached to the decision. Andre read the notice aloud in the break room. Curtis laughed for the first time in over a month. Jamal, running a diagnostic in the next bay, looked up and went right back to work without changing his expression. But Marcus noticed the way his shoulders dropped, a release of something that had been held tight for far too long. The third development unfolded quietly, through channels Marcus only pieced together gradually, over the course of several weeks. A new community development fund had been established, run through an independent nonprofit with no corporate branding attached to it anywhere. The fund provided a long-term lease guarantee for Reeves Auto and Diesel, a full renovation grant for the vocational program, and a healthcare partnership with a pediatric cardiac clinic 2 blocks away that would provide subsidized specialist care for families across the neighborhood. The fund's paperwork listed no individual donor. The nonprofit's registered address belonged to a law office downtown. Marcus recognized that address. He had seen it once before, on correspondence he was never meant to see, in a jacket pocket, on a kitchen counter, in the margins of a life that had only ever been partially visible to him. He sat with that knowledge for nearly a week before he acted on it in any way. What ultimately moved him was not the money, and it was not even the practical rescue of everything he had spent months fighting to protect. It was something smaller. A staff member at the new clinic mentioned in passing that the anonymous donor had specifically requested that no naming rights be attached to any of the funded facilities, no plaques, no dedications, no acknowledgement of any kind whatsoever. When the staff member asked the fund's administrator why, the answer that came back was simple. The donor felt recognition was never what this was for. Marcus thought about that answer for a long time. He thought about a woman who had spent an entire year being loved for exactly who she was when no one was watching, and who was now trying to live up to that same standard, not because anyone would ever see it, not because it would earn her anything at all, but because it was the only honest currency she had left to offer him. He was not finished being hurt. He was honest enough with himself to admit that the hurt would take far longer than a few weeks to work through completely, and that whatever came next between them, if anything came next at all, would need to be built more carefully than what came before, with fewer assumptions and far more deliberate truth from both sides of the table. But he had asked himself to watch what she did when there was no audience left to perform for. He finally had his answer. The renovation of Reeves Auto and Diesel was scheduled to finish on a Saturday in late June. There would be a small neighborhood reopening. No press, no cameras, nothing but the people it actually belonged to. Marcus had agreed to arrive at 8 in the morning to unlock the doors himself. He did not call Grace. He did not send a message. But he left the date written on a slip of paper on his kitchen counter, in handwriting deliberately legible enough to be read without trying too hard. The morning of the reopening broke clear and warm, the kind of June day Baltimore occasionally produced, as though apologizing for the winters it usually inflicted. By 9 o'clock, the block in front of the shop was full. Neighbors stood in loose clusters along the sidewalk, with coffee cups in hand, watching the garage with the particular expression of people who had braced themselves for a loss and were still adjusting to the fact that it never came. The renovation had preserved the bones of the original building. The wide bay doors, the old hand-painted sign restored to its original colors, but added a covered outdoor workspace, a proper classroom with tool storage and whiteboards, and a small medical annex at the far end, staffed 2 days a week by the partnering clinic. Andre and Curtis were already inside, running their hands over the new equipment with the reverence of men who had spent their entire careers learning to make do with less. A cluster of 10 teenagers, including 3 new faces who had signed up after word spread through the neighborhood, stood in the main bay watching Jamal Carter demonstrate a basic engine diagnostic with the quiet authority of someone who had crossed the invisible line from student to teacher without fully realizing it had happened. He was 16.5 years old. He had not stolen anything in over a year. He was explaining torque sequences to a 13-year-old girl who was listening with her entire body. Trent Ashford had once called him someone who had already decided who he was. Jamal, it turned out, had decided differently. Marcus stood near the entrance and watched all of it, letting himself feel the specific, complicated satisfaction of something he had fought for and kept. Zoe moved through the crowd, distributing paper cups of water from a cooler she had insisted on managing entirely by herself, greeting adults by name with the seriousness of a girl performing an important civic duty. When she ran out of cups, she jogged back to her father, leaned against his arm for a moment, and then went completely still. Marcus followed her gaze. Grace was standing at the edge of the lot. She had come alone, no car in sight, which meant she had either walked or taken the bus, and he suspected the second one. She wore a denim jacket over a plain white shirt, dark jeans, and the same worn canvas sneakers she had owned since long before he ever knew her real name. She was carrying a mid-sized toolbox, not new, but clearly cleaned and reorganized, held with both hands in front of her, the way a person holds something they are not entirely certain they still have the right to bring. She did not move toward him. She stood at the edge of the lot and waited, the way a person waits when they understand that the next step is not theirs to take. Zoe looked up at her father. Marcus looked at Grace. He looked at the toolbox. He looked at the woman who had driven him to the very edge of his capacity for trust, and who had spent every month since then doing the only thing that could possibly matter, not explaining, not apologizing in ways that cost her nothing, but changing quietly, without an audience, in the direction of exactly the person she had once claimed to be. He was still hurt. He suspected he would be for a while longer. But hurt and closed were never the same thing, and he had never once been a man who confused the two. Zoe slipped her hand out of his and crossed the lot at a run. Grace set the toolbox down just in time to catch her. Marcus walked over slowly. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him over Zoe's shoulder with an expression that asked for nothing and offered everything, no guarantees requested, no promises demanded, just a woman standing in a parking lot with clean hands and a toolbox, and whatever came next. He reached down and picked the toolbox up himself. "There's a '94 Silverado in the back bay with a transmission that's been waiting 3 weeks, he said. "Think you can follow instructions?" Grace set Zoe down gently, straightened up, rolled her sleeves to the elbow, and looked him directly in the eye. "Show me what to do," she said. He turned and walked into the garage. She followed him inside. Behind them, Zoe watched them go, then turned back to her cooler with the deeply satisfied expression of a girl whose plan had worked out exactly the way she had intended it to. The day carried on around them. The neighborhood stayed exactly where it belonged. Some people hide who they truly are because they are ashamed of it. Grace hid who she was because for the first time in her entire life, she had found something real, and she was terrified of losing it the moment anyone found out the truth. That does not make a person a villain. That makes a person deeply, painfully human. Marcus's response was never to punish her for being afraid. It was to wait, to watch, and to let her own actions finally answer the question her words could never fully settle. Trust, once it has been broken, does not come back all at once. No matter how badly either person wants it to, it comes back the way Grace came back, quietly, without fanfare, carrying a toolbox instead of an apology, proving itself through what a person does when there is no one left keeping score. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who turned out to be more or less than you expected, or of a moment in your own life when you had to decide whether to stay open or stay guarded, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and come back, because there is always another story worth telling.